If you clicked on this video, unfortunately, this probably means that you thought your interviews went well, but you still ended up getting rejected. And that's because you were just a fit for the role, aka you were just average, but you didn't stand out. So in this video, I'm gonna give you expert tips or advanced level tips so that you can actually stand out in your interviews and get more job offers and not just make it to the final rounds. So that means we will not be covering interview basics like the STAR interview method. So if you don't even know what that is, make sure you brush up on the basics by watching this video right over here. Expert tip number one is you want to make sure that you're showing more than you're telling whenever you're answering an interview question. So make sure you have examples to back up all of the things that you're talking about using the STAR method if possible. And make sure that your stories can differentiate you from other candidates. So what I mean by showing instead of telling them that you are good at SQL, give them an example. So say that you know advanced SQL functions and you can do Windows functions and you've used it at your job in order to create certain dashboards that have led to you identifying a new trend that no other analyst was able to figure out. Now, to stand out from everyone else in your interviews, you need to know what makes you different and unique from all the other candidates who have a very similar background as you. Let me give you an example. True or false? If you tell someone in an interview that you work in marketing and you were able to increase revenue by 20%, is that enough to make you stand out in your interviews from all of the other marketing candidates? No, it is not enough to stand out because everyone is going to have similar results as you, aka they're going to have similar endings. So you can't just rely only on the results or the ending of your story. So that means if you want to stand out, the way that you can do that is by focusing on the beginning and middle of your story as well. Okay, let's talk about the beginning of your stories or your examples in your interviews. How can you make the beginnings better? Well, first, this is where you give all the general context about the situation or the problem at work that you were going to solve, right? So when you're giving this context, try to make it sound as complicated as possible. Making the problem that you solved more difficult to the recruiter is going to help you stand out because when they're talking and comparing your story with others, you're obviously going to look better if you're able to solve harder problems. So for example, instead of saying something like, "So I was asked by my manager to figure out why we had lower sales this year." Okay, pause. First of all, if you say that your manager told you to do something, that doesn't make you look good in an interview because it shows that you're not able to proactively think about or identify problems yourself and you need to be told what to do. So instead, start off by saying something like, "Some of the key KPIs that we measure are top line revenue, customer acquisition cost, and conversion rate. And in Q3, we actually noticed that our sales were down comparatively to the year before, even though we had a new digital marketing campaign, which was the strategy that I initially came up with. So I wanted to investigate and figure out why our sales were actually lower that quarter year over year." Okay, next, let's talk about the middle of your story or your interview answers. This is where you show them or explain how you solved a certain problem. So how can you make yourself stand out here? Well, walk them through how you solved the problem, but explain why you made certain decisions and why one decision may have been better than another in that particular instance. Can you think of any time you had options or choices to make that were critical to the overall project being successful? Because if you can walk them through why you chose one decision over another, it's going to help you stand out in your interviews because it shows that you can solve one problem multiple different ways. So make sure you can explain the pros and cons of each of these different decisions. So for example, instead of saying something like, "So to solve this, I basically just asked the marketing team to change strategies and target the enterprise level customers because they actually had the highest conversion rates in the last 6 months." Say this instead. "Well, based on the analysis of the data over the past 6 months, there's really only 2 target customer segments that had the highest conversion rate. The first was our enterprise level customers and the second was the mid-market, not SMB. But this was only concentrated in the tech sector." Now, initially this was actually very surprising because in the previous year we ran a similar marketing campaign and we had much higher conversion rates with the mid-market customers, but not with the enterprise level customers. But I do believe it was actually different this year because we actually had a new product offering and we had won an industry award, which increased our brand recognition. So based on the data, we could have spent our marketing on these 2 segments, but we had a very limited budget. So I made a recommendation that we focus only our marketing budget on the enterprise level customers in the tech sector instead of mid-market. I recommended focusing more on enterprise because they have a much higher contract and deal value. However, the drawback though is that their deal cycles are significantly longer than mid-market. So normally our mid-market customers would actually allow us to hit our sales target faster because of the shorter deal cycle. But that particular year, we had implemented a new CRM system, Salesforce, and we worked with our sales ops team and deals desk team in order to implement the system to decrease our sales cycle for enterprise by about 14 days. Now, let's talk about the ending of your story. If you want to stand out at the end of your story or the results, make sure that the ending of your story is not predictable. So if the interview question leads you or tells you what the ending of your story should be, don't just stop there. Make sure you add additional information. For example, if they ask you something like, tell me about a time you had a conflict with a coworker and how you resolved it. The ending of your story is pretty obvious, right? You're going to resolve a conflict or disagreement that you had with your coworker. Duh. So if you want to stand out at the ending, make sure you talk about how you resolved this issue with your coworker, but then talk about how solving this issue actually allows you to identify another problem, which led you to fix something else. Maybe it made you improve a process, or maybe you identified something wrong in the training, or maybe you realized this was a miscommunication due to a reporting error, and you ended up catching a huge mistake before it would actually become a problem. These are just some examples on how to make the ending unpredictable and help you stand out. Now, the next expert tip to help you stand out is to make your interview feel more like a conversation than an actual interview itself. But how do you do this? Well, do your best to try to turn it into a dialogue after you're done answering an interview question. Or give them a chance to interject and ask you questions halfway through, but don't lose your place in your story and make sure you can pick back up exactly where you were. Now, huge disclaimer, when I'm telling you to make it a conversation and allow them to ask questions, I don't want you to think that it's okay for them to ask you a lot of follow-up questions or a lot of clarifying questions because you're being too vague or they need more information out of you or because you're not directly answering the question. You don't want them to think that they're giving you hints because you keep stopping in the middle of your answer. If they feel that way, that's going to get you rejected. So here's an example of how to turn the interview question into more of a dialogue. Let's say the interview question is, tell me about a time when you had to use data in order to make a decision. So when I was a recruiter for a hardware engineering type startup, we actually needed to hire 100 engineers in our first year. That was entry level all the way up to the executive and principal level. Now, did you want me to kind of break down the specific types of hardware engineering roles that we were trying to hire, or did you want me to focus more on the data analysis part of the question? I only ask because I know in this position, you actually want someone who has experience hiring specific hardware engineers, but I wasn't sure if that was the focus of this question or not. Okay, no worries, I can always circle back to that if you have questions, but focusing on the data, we actually looked at some of our interview pass-through rates as well as our offer decline rates using the data from our ATS system. And I noticed that our pass-through rates were actually fine. There was about 55%, which is around the industry average, but our offer decline rate was nearly 45%, which is significantly higher than the industry. So this data actually shows me that our marketing and branding as a startup is pretty good because our top line candidate pool is very healthy. And it also shows that our interviewers are well-trained, calibrated, and unbiased because we are providing a significant number of offers. But it shows that either our recruiters are bad at closing candidates or our compensation is too low comparatively to the market. Have you run into these types of problems before? Yeah, Sean told me at the beginning of the interview process that your startup is basically kind of in the same phase that mine was as we're focusing on growth. But anyways, back to the data analysis. So those are my expert tips to help you nail your next interview. And if you want more free career advice, make sure you click subscribe down below because I post free weekly videos to help you advance your career. So thank you all for watching and don't be afraid to shake things up.